I know it's been a while, but here is your lesson on sustainable forestry. So, we previously talked about clear cutting, which is a very traditional method of forestry, and now we're going to talk about how we can do it more sustainably. Remember, we're starting to look at solutions, not just environmental problems or how the environment works. So, I know I usually start out with a meme or a comic or something funny, but I just thought this was really cool. If you pause for a moment and read this, it's about a neat forestry technique that is sustainable so that way you don't have to cut down trees. Yeah. All right. So let's talk about methods for mitigating deforestation because there's already deforestation out there. But before we get to that, we haven't talked about the term mitigation yet. Mitigation means you do something to avoid or minimize any negative impacts you have from whatever activity. So let's say we already have people that have deforested an area. You can't reverse time. You can't go back and say, okay, we're gonna make the forest originally like it was, but we can do things to try and minimize the negative impacts. So, for example, replanting, reforestation, taking preventative measures to try and reduce soil erosion, etc. So that's kind of what it talks about on the slide. So let's talk reforestation. Reforestation is something that can happen naturally. So you have a natural disturbance like a wildfire or a drought or some sort of disease. And then you can have natural reforestation, which is just seedlings end up, seeds getting distributed by nearby trees, and those ended up getting into the ground and germinating and growing and becoming baby trees. Then you can also have that natural process of reforestation happen after unnatural disturbances. I want to remind you of a term, and that is anthropogenic, which means caused by humans. So anything that is an unnatural cause would likely be anthropogenic. So that would be logging, mining, building a city, clearing land for agriculture. And in cases like that, it's especially important that we don't just rely on natural regeneration, which can be a pretty slow process and may not create something similar to the original forest, but that we should also plant trees to replace ones that we've lost. So this diagram is showing kind of what you could have as a model for something sustainable. So you have some natural regeneration going on here, and then you have some protected existing native forest that can serve as kind of a seed bank. So it's going to provide seeds to do some natural regeneration. This is restored native forest, so that's something that humans actively did. And then it's monitored to make sure that you have the complex organism interactions and the biodiversity similar to what you had in the native forest. It's especially important when you're thinking about areas that are sloped to make sure they maintain forest and vegetation cover because they're particularly susceptible or vulnerable to runoff. Then another thing that's important is making sure that river areas are riparian areas. So I'll write that larger since I just covered it up. Riparian areas need to be protected because they are also vulnerable to erosion, and it's important to the health of river ecosystems that you leave some native vegetation around them. Another thing here is protective native grassland and wetland. We've talked about the ecosystem services those provide. And then you can still have your urban areas, your agricultural areas, but you're making sure that you have like a sustainable plan for a local area to keep whatever existing forests you have and regenerate some of what is has been lost. So let's talk about some ecologically sustainable forestry techniques. And it's not necessarily going to be the same as with clear cutting, where we have a clear name for it. So, for example, here we have a number of the goals that are a part of sustainably managing a forest. So ultimately, it's meeting our current needs while not jeopardizing future availability for generations. So the goal should be to mimic natural patterns of disturbance and regeneration. So there are natural things that can disturb or destroy forest, wildfire, flooding, etc. And if we kind of mimic those patterns, it makes it a little easier for the ecosystems to survive. Another thing is to minimize erosion because soil erosion can prevent reestablishment of a forest. If you lose all your good soil, you don't have a good soil profile for growing trees. Also, to protect waterways because they're vulnerable to disturbances from clear cutting. Avoid the use of chemical pesticides when possible. We're going to talk about that when we talk about pest management soon. Conserve native tree species instead of just, planting whatever tree you want to harvest next. Make sure there's some native tree species, and also an important thing, maintain their genetic diversity. Because when we have our agriculture notes and what we've talked about in class, when you have low genetic diversity, you have ecosystems that are very vulnerable to disease. Then you can set aside parts of areas that are protected areas where you cannot log at all. This could be areas that are steeply sloped. Like I said, those are very vulnerable to erosion. And then any areas that might be culturally or spiritually significant to local cultures. You can also have these areas designated as high conservation value forests if they have a lot of biodiversity, or if they contain very rare ecosystems, or they're absolutely essential for providing ecosystem services or helping to support the local forest community. And then another thing is it involves planning. You plan and calculate how many trees you can harvest per acre and how fast trees will grow and regenerate, because you don't want to take trees out faster than they can replenish. It might also mean you harvest from an area every 5 years, every 10 years. So the frequency of harvesting can change as well. So, a couple of methods you can do selective harvesting, where you're going to do some small scale clear cutting. So, you'll like clear a patch here and clear a patch there. And that is useful because, like, these trees that are left behind, so you see all these trees were cut down in kind of this little patch right here. And then the trees that were left behind were able to seed the area and help it regenerate. And then, you only remove trees of a specific type or size or quality, so you leave some of the existing trees behind. But this kind of mimics what would happen if you had a local wildfire or a landslide. You're only disturbing a small area. If you look at it from above, like let's say you're doing an aerial view, you might clear some area right here, but the surrounding forest wildlife still have habitat, so they can move out of that area to the neighboring area, and then you can have some species move in once you've had succession established. There's also shelter wood. So some of the you take some of the mature trees, but you leave some of them behind. And then you kind of thin out the trees. That leaves mature trees to support growth from seeds. Another thing that's important is some trees need shade in order to let their saplings grow. Other trees might need full sun. But if you are a tree that is adapted to live in a dense forest, then you're most likely going to need some shade in order to grow properly. So you can have such a thing as too much sun. It depends on what the plant is adapted to. Then you can have something called a seed tree system. So that leaves these occasional seed trees kind of scattered around that can naturally replenish the area. So you have a seed tree cut right here. You leave a few mature trees. Those mature trees will have seedlings, and those seedlings will grow up, and then you can later come back and you can harvest again. Then there are a set of techniques that are called reduced impact logging, which can be used with any of um, the other logging techniques. So they're trying to mitigate negative impacts of not only cutting down the trees, but also hauling them away. Because when you harvest trees, you've got to get them to whatever processing facility you have, and then you've got to get them out to, if you're making furniture, you got to get them to a place that can make the standard size, wood planks and everything that you use to make furniture. And then you've ultimately got to get it to a customer. So some of the things that are included in this is once again planning. So planning is important. You plan also the construction of roads because you want to make sure you minimize disturbance to the ecosystem. Skid trails and landings, which are involved in kind of harvesting the trees and getting them out of the way. You're also trying to minimize your soil disturbance. You probably wouldn't put like a dirt road on a steep slope, and you wouldn't put them next to streams or waterways because you're trying to protect them. So that's what I meant said by limiting gradient of roads. So like more even elevation, not on steep slopes. When you're transporting logs, instead of kind of rolling them along the ground or clearing out roads everywhere, you can set up a series of cables to kind of, I guess you could think of it kind of like zip lining, but you're zip lining a log to get it down to the ground. So you attach a log to the set of wires and it gets transported above the level of the forest so you don't erode soil, so you don't clear other trees. And then part of protecting streams and waterways is making sure there are buffer zones and watershed protection areas. So you're leaving trees to protect the waterways. And then there are also ways to kind of make sure that you're cutting in such a way that the trees will fall and not damage other trees that you're trying to leave standing. Cutting stumps low to the ground so you're not leaving like all these inches of usable wood. And also, when you're cutting the wood itself, once you've already harvested it, cutting it in such a way that you're not wasting a lot of wood. So, you may have seen this kind of image on paper products, anything made from wood, and this is the sign of the Forest Stewardship Council. So, if you see this on some sort of wood product, then this is an international group that has these standards for sustainably managing forests. So, if a forest is certified by the Forest Stewardship Council, they should be doing a number of things. So some of these are not ecological, but they are like sociological. So making sure that you're treating your workers and local communities well and not violating the rights of people who are indigenous to the area, who are native to the area. Then there's the economic side, which is making sure that you are going to maintain or improve economic viability. So this is the economic side. This is the social side. And then this is the environmental side. So there are a number of standards that you have to meet in order to be certified from them. And what you can say is you can use this as a consumer um, to decide, okay, I'm gonna buy forest products that are sustainably harvested to make sure that, I'm financially supporting the people who are harvesting the way I want them to. Then there are other things that you can do. So reclaimed wood has become very popular. And so you take lumber that's already been used. Sometimes it can be old buildings that are demolished, etc. And then you take it, you treat it, and you use it for a new purpose. So, for example, when I was looking this up, there are a lot of people who are selling like reclaimed wood tables and dining tables. I believe both of my sisters have reclaimed wood tables. And then I looked up pictures, and this coffee table right here. Ooh, is made from reclaimed wood from some old building. So that makes sure that you don't have to take as much fresh virgin wood. You don't have to go out and cut down more trees. You're reusing some wood, and you're also reducing waste that would otherwise go in a landfill. Then another thing about sustainability, we're going to talk about pests and pathogens. A pathogen is anything that causes disease. So that can be things like fungi, insects, bacteria, nematodes, which are a type of worm, molds, which are a type of fungi, and viruses. So we're going to talk about this in more detail in a different lesson. So I'm just calling it here that the best sustainable method to protect your forest from pathogens is either to remove trees that have been affected or to use something called integrated pest management, which we will learn about. This is just an example of what can happen when you don't manage. Sorry, cat jumped on the computer. When you don't manage pests properly. So, bark beetles are kind of a big scourge in the western part of the United States. What you see in this map is, sorry, what you see in this map is any area that is red has between 50 to 100% of the trees have been damaged. So this image right here is showing you these are healthy trees. These are trees that have been infected by bark beetles and are in the process of dying. So, unfortunately, when a tree is stressed in some way, it's in conditions that are not the optimal or best conditions, like there's a drought or the temperatures are extreme, then a tree is going to become more vulnerable to being infected or infested. And unfortunately, a lot of these things that are infesting or infecting trees do better in warmer weathers. So if you have warmer temperatures, then the populations for these pests can expand greatly and end up causing these outbreaks. Unfortunately, because of climate change, we're going to see an increase in uh, temperature and then changes in precipitation patterns. Some areas will have drought, some areas might have flooding, and that could cause increases in the amounts of forests that are affected by these species. So that's just something to keep in mind. And then another way to manage forests is you all seen on the news people talking about wildfires in California, wildfires in Australia. Unfortunately, with drought as well as higher temperatures, you're going to have an increased risk of fire. And there are also, especially like California, the ecosystem there is technically chaparral, which is my favorite biome to say. So, chaparral is a very fire prone ecosystem. In fact, the plants there have evolved so that some of them don't, their seeds don't germinate until they've caught on fire. So they've basically been kind of roasted by the wildfires passing through, and that allows them to germinate. And so these are just conditions where, it's mostly a dry climate. It's pretty arid, which means dry. And so when it dries out during a dry season, wildfires become more common. Unfortunately, we've had this policy in especially like our national forests of trying to prevent as many fires as possible. But kind of that's an outdated idea. More often now, we do things called prescribed burns. So those are forest fires that are set in a very purposeful way to burn out fuel and prevent larger forest fires from happening. So basically, you plan an area based on what the local conditions are, what like the weather conditions are, where there's a lot of fuel, and then you clear any excess fuels to make sure that um, you're not having an out of control burn. And then you also make sure that the flames don't escape the area where you're trying to do the burn. So you're going to burn a restricted area. You'll set up like fire breaks or maybe use like a natural barrier like a stream, and that should stop the fire and prevent it from spreading. Obviously, you have to be very careful with this because if you're not, you could end up starting one of the wildfires that you are trying to prevent. And so that allows fires that do start, naturally or accidentally to be smaller and easier to contain. Unfortunately, with climate change and changing weather patterns and, hotter temperatures, potential droughts in areas that aren't adapted to that don't have organisms adapted to that. Then you have prior conditions, and then you have basically, an area where you're going to have it very, very likely to have wildfires develop. So that's going to be a big problem in the coming decades. So here is what I was talking about. You find some place with like a natural fire break. So here's a creek. You also have firefighters nearby so that if you do have, because for example, wind can blow like embers across natural barriers. Um, and you can have firefighters nearby to make sure that they suppress any fire outside of the area that you're wanting to burn and make sure that you contain the fire. So you're just setting it in a localized place. You are not trying to start like a huge wildfire, and you're prepared to fight any fire that escapes. And that is it. Those are things that you can do to sustainably harvest trees.